And we continue our Newsmaker Archive series this week. On today's show, we're going to hear Kevin Dorn from May 14th, 2012, talking with Dr. Spencer Annabel about a Civil War prison over in Chemung County.
A very interesting story about a not very far place with a very bad reputation. Stay tuned. Dr. Spencer Annabel, expert in the Civil War.
Thank you.
Oh, well, listen. I think Dr. Gary Astrar, my good friend at Alfred University, he is the one who says you know more about Civil War than he does.
He's very kind.
Well, he's also very smart, so I would take that as a real compliment. Now, Dr. Annabel is going to talk today about the prison in Elmira. Not the one that's currently there, but one that has a very, very bad reputation in the Civil War. Some years ago, I did an interview with a fellow in Elmira. He was an historian. Some say a historian. Doesn't sound right to me. An historian. Anyway, he was in history.
Yes.
And it was about that terrible prison in Elmira. Now, friends, most of you know about or have heard about Andersonville, which was the rebel prison in what state was Georgia?
Georgia. In rural Georgia.
And it was a terrible place, and you know nothing too terrible could be said about it. But right here within the range of my voice, we had our own. Well, I say we. The Union had its own prison, also of terrible reputation among Southerners and Northerners who understood the situation. Dr. Annabel knows a lot about it. I'm going to let him take over right now and talk about it. Go ahead, Doc.
The reason we're doing the program, we just spent the weekend doing the Elmira, and it's the first time the Elmira reenactment has been held on the actual ground on the banks of the Chemung River where the Civil War prison was located. So we were on hallowed ground this weekend. Over 2,900 Confederate POWs died there between July 1864 and when the prison was closed in July 1865.
When was it opened, by the way?
July 1864. It was opened. Now,
so nearly 3,000 rebels died there in a matter of a year or less.
Now, we every fall go down to the National Cemetery in Elmira, just down the street from the state prison. There's the National Cemetery where the nearly 3,000 Confederates who died there are buried in the cemetery, and we do memorials for all of them, and specifically the 7 members of the 21st Georgia who died as POWs and are buried there. The cemetery is a separate story. A runaway slave from North Carolina, John W. Jones, who freed himself, was the cemetery caretaker of that cemetery at the time of the Civil War. He interred each of the dead Confederate soldiers. They were buried in trench graves, shoulder to shoulder to shoulder, got each a tombstone with their company, their rank, and the regiment of which they had served. And after the war, daughters of the American Confederacy came up from Richmond to disinter their dead and bring them home, and found the cemetery so well laid out that they didn't disturb a single grave.
Was that because of the runaway slave?
It was. It was
Isn't
all
that
John
ironic?
W. Jones.
Isn't that ironic?
He found these as human victims of the war. And the average soldier he would have buried, probably none of them were slave owners. They were the common men from the South trying to defend their way of life. And the Elmira Historical Association has restored his home next to the cemetery, and it's now part of the on the National Register of Historic Places, and at least on the outside can be viewed by the public.
Small little place?
It's a fairly small house, yeah.
Did he have a family? I never knew about this
I do
person.
not know if he had a family, but he did.
That's a part of that story I didn't know.
Yes.
I'm glad you've told me that. All right, keep going.
At any rate, having been invited to the actual grounds of the Civil War prison, by the way, it was known to the rebels and people in the Confederacy not as Elmira, but as Elmira. An excellent book has recently been written about it by Michael Horrigan. It's called Elmira, the Death Camp of the North.
Boy, I want to get that book.
And make no mistake about it, it was a camp of extermination. Now, how did this happen? In 1864, when General Grant assumes overall command of the Union Army, he and the Lincoln administration make a very sound strategic decision. They will stop prisoner of war exchanges, knowing full well there are 7 million whites in the South before the war started, 21 million in the North. And if they stop exchanging prisoners, and the way exchange worked, when a man of equal rank was captured, you would eventually exchange one Union private for one Confederate private. And once they were paroled and the exchange completed, they could go back and join their armies. So Grant used the excuse that the Confederacy did not regard black American soldiers as prisoners of war, but would put them into slavery as the excuse to stop the prisoner exchange. The real reason he stopped it was he knew the Confederacy was going to run out of soldiers first. What happened was the prison system for the Confederacy and the Union was not designed to accept the numbers that would be coming to them. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, probably Lincoln's most effective cabinet secretary throughout the war, great Secretary of War, but an extremely vengeful and angry man.
A little bit unbalanced, too.
Well, man, really vengeful. He was aware of the conditions in Andersonville. What he did not know was the starvation ration the Union prisoners of war were on in Andersonville was the same ration their guards were eating. The Confederacy was running out of everything. Andersonville had been designed to house about 10,000 prisoners. Before the prison hit its peak, or at its peak, it was housing 35,000 prisoners, not 10,000, on 13 acres. Camp was poorly laid out. The water was foul.
Which one are we talking about now?
Andersonville.
All right, okay.
And the death rate in Andersonville for the entire war was 29%. Now, the Union had its share of infamous prisons. Camp Douglas in Chicago was a hellhole. Yeah. Dry Tortugas, U.S. Fort, and off the tip of Florida. You roasted to death or died of sunburn or yellow fever. Fort Monroe at the tip of the peninsula. And Elmira. Of all of those, Elmira was singularly the worst. And the death rate there, they housed 12,122 prisoners during the war. It was open from July of 64 to 65. And the death rate at Elmira, in a land of plenty, was 24.3%.
Okay.
And you can point to the camp commandant, Colonel Benjamin, and each of these camps were run by a Union colonel. Mm-hmm. And they would try to toe the Secretary of War's orders to the letter, so to get a promotion, get a good record as the camp commandant. If that meant starving the men there, that's what it meant. A number of people had tried to blame the camp physician, saying he was a butcher. He actually wrote to the War Department a number of times trying to get better supplies for the men, and of course this was systematically turned down.
Okay, now wait, we're talking with Dr. Spence Annabel. We're not talking about Andersonville, about which movie was made, and by the way, either Angelica or Andover. Fella from there. You must know this. Which one? And,
not sure.
Okay, well, there's an Allegheny County guy who was a Union prisoner in Andersonville, talking about Civil War here, and he was literate, which not a lot of them were, and actually had a good pen. So he was the officer at Andersonville for the Confederates. He used him as a secretary, but this guy also had the goods on the officer in Andersonville.
Actually, he was Swiss. Henry Weitz. He was Swiss.
But he
and he spoke with a heavy German. Remember, Switzerland has different accents depending on what part of the country you're in.
Guy knows more than anything, right?
Henry Wirtz was an easy scapegoat after the war.
That's right. Well, it was this guy's testimony, anyway, that got him hung. Yeah. I just wanted to use that as an aside. It was somebody, either Andover or Angelica, I think Angelica.
And Henry Wirtz was a Swiss citizen with a heavy German accent, and because of that accent, and the Union wanted a pound of revenge. He was hung, and in actuality, in the investigation of the record thoroughly, he laid out the camp poorly. he would petition the Confederate government for better supplies that they never got.
Well, they didn't have them.
And I really think he was no more guilty of anything than any of the Union commanders.
Okay, let's go back to Elmira.
Yes.
We'll take a brief break and then back to Elmira Prison right after this.
Over the years, countless Christmas legends and customs have evolved, but the traditions most precious are those we hand down from our own hearths and homes. The people at Mike Palmer's Plumbing, Heating, and Air Conditioning, Route 36, Canisteo, hope your Christmas will be warm with love and peace, a beautiful time for sharing. A dream is a wish your heart makes, and as Christmas draws upon us, may many hearts dream of what they most desire. The Christmas wish from Randy and Lori at Pro Street Auto in Troopsburg is that all your best dreams come true and for peace for people all over the world.
And before we get back to that Newsmaker with Kevin Dorn and Dr. Spencer Annabel, let's check in with meteorologist Rob Carolyn.
Well, I can tell you we have a big storm in the central part of the United States this morning, Brian, bringing blizzard conditions to parts of the Dakotas and heavy thunderstorms to eastern Texas and Louisiana. This storm system is going to pass primarily off to the north and west of the region. That puts us on the mild side of the system. So we're going to be talking about some noticeably warmer temperatures as we head through the next 36 hours. A lot of cloudiness out there this morning, Brian. It should remain in place, mostly cloudy, breezy today. We're up to about 40 to 45. Tonight it looks like we'll have cloudy and breezy conditions with some rain developing. An evening low of 40, temperatures on the rise as the night goes on. For tomorrow, cloudy, breezy, scattered showers are possible. Highs will be 55 to 60 tomorrow. Showers possible tomorrow night. They'll taper off and end. It'll be breezy 35. Saturday, cloudy, breezy, and a lot colder with a high of 35 to 40. And the chance on Saturday for a few flurries or snow showers, Brian.
Hey, we use that for the theme every time. The good doctor's on. Dr. Spence Annabel, who was an excellent physician, according to Surgeon Joe McCormick, smartest guy he knows.
That's very kind of Joe. Very kind.
I'm just telling you. And according to Dr. Gary Ostrower, historian extraordinaire, he knows more about Civil War than anybody. All right, and I got to tell you, I've heard him talk about it, and he does. I've heard him give an hour-long talk without using one note. All right, now, we're talking about the infamous prison in Elmira, which to a rebel was called Hellmira. About 20 years ago, I interviewed someone from Elmira who was a history buff, more than a buff, I think a teacher, knew a lot about it, maybe the guy that wrote this book for all I know. And he said he was sitting in an airport in Atlanta. And this very friendly woman next to him said, "Where are you from, sir?" And said, "I'm from Elmira." She got up and walked away.
Yeah.
I mean, and that would have been, what, the 1960s, perhaps, about 100 years after the war?
Yeah.
That's how infamous that place was.
We have just come back recently from having done a weekend Civil War event for the first time on the actual grounds of the banks of the Chemung River, where the prison camp was. We actually did a 2-day encampment there and fought a battle each day and set up our field hospital. The mayor of Elmira came by on Sunday by the organizer of the event. They'd worked 18 months to put this event on for the first time on the grounds of the people living on Water Street. Within a stone's throw of this, many of them had no idea what had been there in the Civil War. No idea.
It was covered up.
It was covered up. Now, the title of the book is Elmira, Death Camp of the North. Now, why did so many Confederates die there? Over 24% of the 12,000 Confederates interred there died. Secretary Edwin Stanton was a very vengeful and angry man. He wanted to reduplicate the conditions of Andersonville as close as he could. And I believed, I'll give him a break, I think he was under the impression our men were being systematically, purposely starved in the Confederate prisons, such as Andersonville. The Union prisoners. Now, what he may not have known is they ate the exact same rations as the Confederate guards. The Confederacy was running out of everything. All the camps, north and south, suffered from overcrowding because they were built before the prisoner exchange was stopped, and it's like you take the cork out of a bottle, close the outlet valve, and just start filling it, and they all got overcrowded. But Stanton went out of his way. He would refuse to let the guards give any of the clothing or blankets sent to the prisoners, captured in their summer uniform, to house one miserable winter in Elmira. Actually, two miserable winters. Now, the original barracks, built when it was a marshaling area for troops in western New York going into the Union Army, were fairly well built. The later barracks, built to house prisoners, were made of crude boards, big cracks in between. One big barracks, maybe 40 feet wide, 120 feet long, had one small wood stove. They got 7 pieces of firewood a night. And even this event, where it was warmer, the wind was howling down that river, and you can imagine that in January. And one of the sides of the camp is Foster's Pond that's still there today. As I said, the death rate was extreme. He made sure, Stanton did, that the rations of the prisoners were every bit as meager as they were in
showing that he was no better than...
He was a very vindictive, angry man.
Yeah, he was.
Now,
nuts, too.
Well, I can't state that. He was very effective as a Secretary of War.
Yeah.
I'll give him that credit. Well,
he
anyway,
was a little nuts. Right, go ahead.
And that's a generous comment for me because Stanton was a Democrat. But be that as it may.
Steubenville, Ohio.
Back to the, very good. Back to the, Elmira story. The food ration was deliberately rigged so the Confederates couldn't get it. The beef had to be a certain proportion of bone and really crappy, and the beef they were sent was far too good a quality. So the prison authorities would take it to town and sell it on the black market because the prisoners didn't qualify for it. Probably the most touching thing I saw this weekend, one of our members has on extended loan from the Union Drummer Boy Historical Museum and Shop in Gettysburg, a bracelet handmade of bone by one of the Confederate POWs, and this guy must have been a craft person of exceptional quality in jewelry making. It's made of bone. The pieces are pinned together, hand-carved, exquisite, and on each piece is a letter of Elmira. And a small Mason symbol is carved on one of them, and 1864 is written on another. And exquisite. These craftsmen were allowed to make things, and the guards would take them into town and give the craftsmen a percentage,
Well, at least some of the guards were decent.
Yeah.
Guys running the prison, they were making money on the side by bootlegging the beef. That's what
bootlegging the beef.
That's right.
Probably sold the clothing and blankets sent by the relatives that the prisoners weren't permitted to get. Now,
so much for the gentleman's war.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, the other thing, the camp was miserably cold. It was by a swamp. During 64, the camp flooded. We're right down on the banks of the Chemung River. And the prisoners were having to sleep in the 3rd and 4th racks to stay out of the water. I could imagine, you go over the dike to get into this camp where we had our reenactment, I can imagine what a miserable place that was. It had to have been mosquito-infested. Foster's Pond was there. It was a camp engineered for disaster, and the death toll was staggering. It's one of the sadder events in our Union history. The camp doctor, Dr. Tracy, they tried to put some of the blame onto him. He petitioned the federal government for better supplies and things, did the best he could with what he had, which was virtually almost nothing. I want to close with a famous train wreck.
All right.
In 64, an Erie troop train with Confederate POWs was coming up through Pennsylvania to come to the prison. And a drunken Erie dispatcher dispatched a troop train and a coal train on the same track, headed to each other.
Intentionally?
No, he was drunk.
Oh, okay.
And the trains came around 2 sharp turns, saw each other. The only engine crew on one side, some of the guys jumped just before the collision. The engineer in the troop train was impaled by the wood in the tender against his firebox and cooked like a hamburger. 68 Confederates were crushed and killed to death or burned. 17 Union guards. These were wooden cars, so when the train slammed to a halt, all the cars telescoped inside each other. All the guards on either end of the platform were just immediately pancaked, and 68 Confederates and 17 Union soldiers died in that wreck. It was hot. They were so badly damaged they just buried them by the tracks. Years later, they were disinterred and brought back to the cemetery where the Confederate POWs are buried.
And a good part of the story was the runaway slave who treated
John W. Jones,
who treated the Confederate soldiers with some
respect,
dignity, right?
And laid out a beautiful cemetery.
Weren't there efforts by church groups in Elmira? I mean, weren't there decent people in Elmira who wanted to help? If there were in Andersonville, they wouldn't have been able to help.
There were actually there were people in Andersonville that would come to the fence and pass some food in. There were some people in Elmira, I don't think they were allowed to, and one thing that was very humiliating, the guards or prison officials, to make more money, built an elevated platform, and the natives of Elmira could come and look at the rebels and pay $1. And this greatly angered the Confederate POWs. They were being put on display.
Some of them
like
used to moon
animals.
them. Yeah.
Moon them.
I don't blame them. Yeah, I understand, yes.
The monodigital salute.
Okay, well, there we go. We'll have to do another show on this, the infamous prison in Elmira. And there's still bitterness in some parts of the South where their relatives were killed. About Andersonville,
it was a prison out of control and out of supplies.
The people were suffering right along with them. So we'll talk about Camp Douglas in Chicago sometime, because there's a lot of funny stories about terrible
political
stories.
Corruption, martial law.
Nothing new.
Arresting the citizens of Chicago.
Yeah, I mean, they were crooks even then.
Prisoners running amok.
Yeah. Used to go into town and have beer and come back
and
out.
Go to the houses of ill repute.
I don't want to talk about that. That's it for now. Stay tuned for more news.
You are funny. I don't want to talk about that.
From May 14th, 2012, Dr. Spencer Annabel speaking with Kevin Dorn on a Newsmaker show about a Civil War prison in Elmira. I'm Brian O'Neill. Thanks so much for listening. It's AM 1480 Wlea Hornell.